Those were the last words John Edward Jones spoke to the first rescuer who reached him.
There's an incredible sense of disappointment.
I couldn't see his body at all.
He didn't have any leverage.
He had already spent hours trapped upside down, deep underground, his body jammed in a hole no wider than his shoulders. By nightfall, the cave had become his tomb, and though John was still alive, his time was running out. On the evening of November 24th, 2009, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, 26-year-old medical student, husband and father, John Edward Jones joined his younger brother Josh and a group of family and friends for a short holiday adventure. Their destination was Nutty Putty Cave, a popular beginner's cave southwest of Salt Lake City, Utah. Named for the soft, brown, putty-like clay that coated many of its passages, Nutty Putty was a network of rooms linked by narrow tunnels and twisting corridors, the kind of underground labyrinth that draws those fascinated by caving, or spelunking, as it's known in the United States. But Nutty Putty had a reputation. Between 1999 and 2004, at least 6 rescue missions had taken place inside the cave. In one case, a teenager had been trapped upside down overnight before being pulled free. In 2006, officials gated and closed the cave, citing safety concerns. They warned that the cave was too dangerous and was a ticking time bomb. But many locals fought to keep it open, insisting that with proper precautions, the risks could be managed. Nutty Putty finally reopened in March 2009, just 8 months before John's visit, under a permit-only system. It required every group to include at least 2 experienced cavers. Josh secured the permit for their group of 11. John and Josh were seasoned cavers, having spent their childhood exploring underground alongside their father, the head of the Utah Cave Rescue. But by 2009, John was no longer the lean teen he'd once been and hadn't caved in years. That night, the group, 11 people in total, entered the cave around 8 p.m. They made their way through its narrow corridors and angled drops and entered the big slide, a sloped chamber with a rope to guide climbers and one of the cave's more accessible chambers. After exploring the larger chambers, John, Josh, and 2 others decided to find the birth canal, a tight, well-known passage that only the most flexible cavers attempted. On the map, the birth canal was marked clearly, just past the big slide. John led the way, crawling on his stomach toward what he believed was the entrance to the birth canal with Josh close behind. The tunnel split, and John turned into the left-hand passage, a narrow, twisting squeeze that felt no different from the route he expected. In that moment, without realizing it, he had made a critical mistake. What John believed to be the entrance to the birth canal was actually a nearby unmapped offshoot, known unofficially as Ed's Push. This passage was rarely explored and not shown on the official maps, simply omitted because so few had ever entered it, and its tight, twisting shape made it difficult to survey. John led the others down this route and eventually reached one of the most treacherous stretches of Ed's Push, a tight, contorted passage aptly named the Corkscrew. Only the smallest, most flexible people had ever navigated it successfully. 5 years earlier, 16-year-old Brock Clark had become wedged here for 14 hours before rescuers could free him. He was 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds. At 6 feet and 210 pounds, John was a far larger caver than the Corkscrew was meant to allow. Yet, after contorting into an L shape, he somehow managed to squeeze through. The passage widened slightly toward a ledge, but John knew he couldn't turn back and would need to find an opening ahead. Exhaling fully, he squeezed over the ledge, only to find no space, just a 45-degree slope pulling him downward. Too exhausted to stop himself, he moved slightly further until he could brace and think. He signaled Josh not to follow, fearing the slope would trap him too. After a quick discussion, they agreed his best option was to continue in search of a wider space to turn. Fatigued, John crawled forward and spotted a narrow vertical fissure that seemed to lead down into a wider chamber. It looked like a typical feature of the real birth canal. If he could just squeeze through, he thought he'd be able to turn around in the large chamber. He exhaled to flatten his chest, sucked in his stomach, and slipped over the ledge. That single breath was the last bit of freedom his body would have. As his lungs expanded again, John became lodged, head first, in a vertical passage only 10 inches high and 18 inches wide. Smaller than the opening of a front-load washing machine, John was now completely stuck. No room to turn, no way to back out. His arms were trapped by his sides, his legs bent up behind him at a sharp angle, and worst of all, he was inverted, with his head tilted down into darkness, a position the human body cannot survive for long. He tried to wriggle. Nothing. By the time Josh reached him, all he could see was John's shoe protruding from the rock, as if the cave had swallowed him whole. Josh tried to pull John out, but only managed to shift him by a few inches, and in doing so, made it worse. John slipped even further down the passage. Now, fully inverted, with his body folded and pinned, John Jones was trapped 700 feet underground in one of the tightest known sections of the cave. Eventually, Josh had to make the hardest decision of his life: leave his brother in the darkness, crawl back up through the twisting rock, and call for help. The time was now just after 9 p.m., and deep inside Nutty Putty, John was a ticking time bomb. At just after midnight, more than 3 hours after John had first become stuck, the first rescue worker reached him. Her name was Susie Matola, a local volunteer who responded immediately when she saw the page alert come through. She was the first person outside John's group to reach his position deep in the cave. Even before seeing him, Susie knew this rescue would be difficult. The passage was tight, awkward, and sharply sloped, accessible only by crawling headfirst through narrow rock. When she finally arrived at John's location, the situation was worse than she had imagined. She greeted him, trying to keep her voice calm and upbeat. It was the first of several quiet, heartbreaking statements John would make over the coming hours. Despite the pain, he remained polite, lucid, and cooperative. Susie tried everything she could think of. She spoke calmly. She offered reassurances. She even tried cutting off parts of John's clothing to make more room around his waist and chest. But nothing worked. The rock was too tight and the angle was too sharp. After nearly 2 hours of trying alone, Susie crawled back to the surface to regroup. By then, more than 30 people, including John's pregnant wife, Emily, were gathered outside the cave. Over the next few hours, rescuers, engineers, and emergency crews began arriving in large numbers. Eventually, more than 100 people would be involved in the rescue attempt. Back underground, the rescuers brainstormed possibilities. Some options were ruled out immediately. Breaking John's legs to extract him was considered, but dismissed due to risk of death from internal bleeding. Lubricating the shaft was also suggested, but the angle and tightness of the passage made it impossible to apply consistently or effectively. They settled on the most viable option: a rope and pulley system. The plan was to drill small holes into the surrounding rock and secure anchor bolts. A team of rescuers would then loop ropes around John's legs and carefully pull him back out, inch by inch. To reduce the pressure on his chest, they would try to elevate his position even slightly. Every inch mattered. But even getting the equipment down to his location was a challenge. The cave's layout meant that transporting tools and supplies to the rescue site took over an hour per trip, and only one person at a time could descend into the narrow passageway. Making matters worse, John's inverted position was becoming more than a physical barrier. It was becoming a medical emergency. When the on-site trauma surgeon, Dr. Doug Murdoch, was told John had been upside down for hours, he gave a grave warning. Inversion that long could be fatal. The human body isn't designed to be upside down. In that position, blood and fluids pool in the head and chest, placing extreme pressure on the brain, heart, and lungs. As the hours pass, organs begin to fail, and asphyxiation becomes a serious threat. Rescuers reported hearing a rattling sound in John's chest, a sign that fluid was already collecting in his lungs. Time was now the enemy, and the team needed to move fast. They began drilling, secured the bolts, and attached the ropes. Then, slowly, they began to pull. By the time the pulley system was finally completed, it was 4 p.m. on November 25th, and John had been trapped for more than 19 hours. They had secured the system using bolts drilled into the rock walls. The plan was to pull John upward, legs first, slowly freeing him from the fissure. Even just elevating him a few inches might ease the strain on his lungs and heart. Rescuer Ryan Schertz talked John through what to expect. It worked, at first. With each pull, John rose slightly. It was agonizing. His legs couldn't fully bend around the curve of the passage. His back scraped against the rock. The lip of stone he had slid over, the one he'd exhaled to pass, was now pressing into his chest. But inch by inch, he was moving. For the first time since he became trapped, John was high enough to make eye contact with a rescuer. Despite the pain, he seemed coherent. When Ryan asked how he was doing, he gave a quiet, bitter smile. The rescuers took this as a good sign. He was in pain, but he was still present, still alert. They paused, letting John rest while they adjusted their grip. John's pregnant wife, Emily, and their 1-year-old daughter, Lizzie, had initially stayed behind with some of his family. But now Emily was waiting at the cave entrance, and a 2-way radio had been lowered earlier, allowing John to speak with her. The conversation was brief and emotional, but it helped keep him calm. Then, disaster struck. On what was supposed to be the 4th pull, something gave way. A loud snap echoed through the tunnel. One of the anchor bolts, drilled into the cave wall to support the pulley system, had come loose. Simultaneously, part of the rock collapsed, sending debris crashing down the shaft. The rescuer closest to John was Ryan, and he was struck in the face by one of the falling bolts and temporarily blacked out. When he came to, there was dust, silence, and darkness. And John was no longer where he had been. In the chaos, he had slipped back down into the crevice. All the progress, hours of planning, drilling, adjusting, pulling, was undone in seconds. Despite being badly injured, Ryan spoke to John and reassured him that another rescuer would soon come down to take his place. And when the second lead rescuer, Ryan's father, Dave Schertz, finally reached John, he heard him whisper. Dave reassured him they'd get him out, but noticed that John began to grow quiet, his breathing slowing. Dave managed to loop a rope around John's waist, but even he became stuck and had to be rescued by others, sustaining multiple injuries in the process. A third and final rescuer, Brandon Kowalis, a member of the Utah Cave Rescue, squeezed into the cave to take over for Dave. By the time Brandon reached him, John was unconscious. Without John's help, repositioning his legs around the overhang was impossible. John's breathing was deep and gurgling, as if his lungs were filling with fluid. His feet twitched, then kicked violently, before going still again. Moments later, Brandon heard what sounded like a final gasp. Still unsure if John was alive, Brandon and other rescuers worked to widen the passage, and after 2 hours, they had gained only 2 inches, and John was still silent. Back at the surface, John's wife Emily waited with hope and fear. She was pregnant, standing just outside the cave, surrounded by rescuers, family, and strangers. She had spoken to John earlier through a radio. His voice had sounded tired, but steady. Now, the silence from below was unbearable. The rescuers still hoped he was alive. Technically, he was, though unconscious. In a final effort to comfort him, they lowered the radio again, letting Emily speak to him one last time. Her words were soft, loving, and painfully hopeful, but John wouldn't push again. At 11:56 p.m., on November 25, 2009, more than 28 hours after he had become trapped, John Edward Jones was pronounced dead. A paramedic had reached him just moments earlier and found no pulse. Inversion, compression, and oxygen deprivation had finally overcome his body. His heart could no longer sustain the fight. He had died upside down, in the same cramped space where he had begged simply to get out. Word spread quickly through the cave and up to the surface. Emily was in disbelief, and at first, she refused to accept the news, questioning whether a leg pulse was enough to confirm death. But eventually, she accepted the truth. He was gone. But then came the question no one wanted to face: what to do with John's body? In the hours that followed, rescuers remained underground, trying to decide what to do next. Though John was gone, his body was still lodged deep inside the rock, And now they were faced with an agonizing reality. Removing him would be nearly impossible. Even when he had been alive, the angle, the position, and the fragility of the passage had made every inch of movement dangerous. Now, with no ability for his muscles to aid the process, extracting his body would require breaking bones, removing rock, and risking more lives. One member of the rescue team described the area where John was trapped as the worst possible place to be stuck. It was nearly vertical, narrower than his shoulders, and shaped in a way that made turning, pulling, or twisting impossible. Despite this, officials considered every option, even the most gruesome. But no plan could guarantee that John's body would come out intact, or that rescuers wouldn't be seriously injured in the attempt. In the end, they reached a heartbreaking decision. John's body would remain where it was, sealed within the cave. The response from the landowner was immediate and emotional. Horrified by what had happened, he initially suggested using dynamite to collapse the cave entirely, destroying it forever. But rescue officials convinced him otherwise. Instead, a simpler solution was chosen. On December 1st, 2009, just 6 days after John's death, the entrance to Nutty Putty Cave was sealed permanently with a concrete plug. John's remains were still inside. At the entrance, John's family installed a brass plaque in his memory, not just as a marker of loss, but as a warning to others. It includes a tribute to his kindness, his humor, his love of family, and his faith. His brother Josh, who had crawled in with him that night, never returned to the cave again. John Edward Jones was 26 years old, a husband, a father, and a medical student training to become a pediatric cardiologist. He had entered the cave seeking adventure and a story to share. Instead, the story had become his own.